All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. We are just getting started. Welcome to the January frame session. Today, we are really excited to host Professor David Coolidge, inshallah, on this discussion on Sunni-Shi'i engagement, especially in the Islamic tradition, and the importance for us to know the Shia literature as American Muslims as we try to increase our Islamic literacy. I'm really excited for this conversation. I think it'll be really beneficial. There's a lot of people I've seen sharing it who are excited to hear this topic. I think we haven't had this discussion yet on Frame, so it should be really interesting. So we'd like to invite you to kind of tune in, join in with the comments, share any thoughts, any questions that you have for Professor David Coolidge and for Ustadh Ubaydullah as they go into the conversation. Before I begin, we want to make a few quick announcements. The first announcement is that we just wrapped up, alhamdulillah, our winter program in Virginia at the Adams Center. It was really exciting. It was a really beneficial conference. We had, I know, definitely over 100 participants come from all over the country and attend. We had Dr. Jackson came, Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans, Dr. Zainab Alwani, and Imam Majid tune in, alhamdulillah. And it was a live conversation. It was really exciting, inshallah. So if you were able to attend, please let us know in the comments what did you find beneficial, any gems that you thought. We'd love to hear from you. And if you were not able to attend, you can still register, I believe, to get access to the live recordings of that weekend, alhamdulillah. So for those of you who weren't able to come, I would definitely check that out because there are so many gems and so much beneficial conversation through that. The other announcement is we have our book club next week. So for those of you who are new, perhaps to ALIM Frames, there is a monthly book club that ALIM hosts with Ustadh Ubaydullah, and they read all sorts of books, different topics, genres, fiction, nonfiction. And this week or next week, they'll be reading The Song Poet, which I believe is fiction, and Ustadh Ubaydullah will be joining in a discussion on that. You can register at the link that we will share in the chat to tune into that. It is live, and so you get to interact with the scholars and with different people who are interested in reading all over the country. So we posted the link in the chat. You can register for that and check that out. The other announcement that we have is that our summer program is quickly approaching. It's a few short months away, and I believe we're already close to having a wait list if you don't have one already. So we are accepting applications. So if you have not applied yet and you're curious about it, then definitely apply as soon as possible. You can check that out at animprogram.com or .org to learn more about the summer program and how you can register, what the topics are. We definitely encourage you to do so. Professor David Coolidge, I believe, was a graduate from the ALIM Summer Program, as was Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans. So it's the ALIM family stays strong throughout the year. So definitely check it out if you are looking for a good place to increase in your Islamic education and knowledge here in the U.S. and get access to scholars and people all across the country. And the last announcement that we have is to please support ALIM. We are currently fundraising for the summer program. We typically give about like 70% of the students scholarships. So we're currently fundraising to be able to give those scholarships to allow as many people as we can to come to ALIM and to attend the program, either full scholarships, partial scholarships, so people who might not be able to have access to this level of knowledge and scholarship generally, we'll be able to give it to them through the scholarships, inshallah. So if you can, please do support and donate. We are doing our campaign, and we'll share the link for that in the chat. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans on and Professor David Coolidge, but I'll read David Coolidge's bio first. So he recently received his PhD at the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley, California, mashallah. From 2008 to 2013, he worked as a Muslim chaplain, first at Dartmouth College and then at Brown University. And from 2014 to 2017, he taught at an undergraduate course on Islamic law and ethics at New York University. He has served on the board of various American Muslim institutions, including Zaytuna and Ta'rif. He converted to Islam in 1998, and he's married to Sumaya Balbel, daughter of early American Muslim activist Shafi and Nishat Balbel. Allah have mercy on them. So without further ado, Ustadh Ubaydullah and Professor David Coolidge, inshallah, welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وبعد. السلام عليكم Dave.
Wa alaikum salam, Ubaydullah. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, man. How are things? How have you been?
Alhamdulillah. Everything's good.
Alhamdulillah, very good, man.
How are
Just
things with you?
go
You in
ahead.
Chicago?
I'm in Chicago, man, and things have been unseasonably mild. So we're very thankful for what we consider uh, quite favorable weather. But talking to somebody in the Bay Area, I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Maybe, this is something you'd still consider torture.
Yeah, I had to go to an academic conference at the beginning of January, and as I was driving away from O'Hare and I saw those gray skies, I had a lot of, harsh memories of Chicago winters. So I don't envy you.
Although you did grow up in Chicago then.
Yeah, northern suburbs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I'm excited about this evening's conversation. Um, the way that we sent it out to folks was that, you wanted to address the topic of Sunni-Shi'i dialogue, kind of in the American Muslim community. Why don't you start by telling me why this is of interest to you?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah alladhi allama bil qalam, allama al-insana ma lam ya'lam, wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi wa sallam. Thank you so much for having me. As a former ALIM Summer Program 2001 graduate and ALIM El Lisan Arabic Program 2002 and ALIM Winter Program New York City 2007, if I recall. It's nice to be back. I'm particularly interested in this subject because I spent, approximately 15 years ensconced in the American Sunni community with very little engagement directly with the Shi'i tradition, other than through my own reading and my academic studies at Princeton University, where I was enrolled as a PhD student beginning in 2002. And I had a number of questions about the Shi'i tradition. I was very interested in the Shi'i tradition and many of the theological and historical and mystical issues that it raised. But it wasn't really until I was, an adjunct faculty at NYU and also volunteering in the Islamic Center at NYU under the leadership of Imam Khalid Latif that I really had a chance to experience the Shi'i community through one of the sort of preeminent, you could say, rituals and gatherings that happen historically for the Shi'i community, which is the Majalis of Imam Hussein, alayhi salam, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, may peace and blessings be upon him and his family. For there was a program called Muharram in Manhattan that was happening there. And, they were gathering every night to commemorate what happened in the year 680 to Imam Hussein at Karbala. And so I attended out of a sort of ecumenical spirit that I was one of the leaders of the NYU community, and my Shi'i brothers and sisters were gathering for what was a very sacred moment for them. So I should be in attendance on the first night. But I thought I would go the first night and then that would be it. But it was a very transformative experience. And it ended up leading me to return again and again to those gatherings, as well as to visit various Shi'i masjids around New York and New Jersey, and such as those affiliated with the Iranian community or with the Pakistani community or the Khoja community. As well as a masjid in Brooklyn, which had a sizable number of Black and Latino Shi'is. And then eventually going to Karbala for ziyarah, for a journey to visit the grave of Imam Hussein and Imam Ali in Najaf. And through that process, I realized that even though I had been, called Ustadh David Coolidge, and I had been given permission to teach various texts in the Sunni tradition, and I was often invited to different things, that I was really ignorant of the Shi'i tradition. and that there was this whole parallel history and a whole parallel, bibliography and textual canon and whole parallel sense of what even the transmission of Islam in the West, meant from the Shi'i perspective. And so, I began by sort of delving into it just, to understand more about the Shi'i tradition. And that eventually led me to identifying with, the way of the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, as understood, within the Shi'i tradition as sort of my preeminent paradigm of expressing my own commitment to Islam. But what I would like to say, which might not be obvious, to many people, because I've had many conversations, I've many teaching opportunities over the years, and I have a somewhat unique way of thinking about the Islamic tradition that not everybody shares. So I just want to make sure that that's clear up front, which is that I believe that there's something what I call meta-Islam, and that is the Islamic tradition that is there all the time, especially in the early period, but we don't put a name to it. So the way I try to help people understand this is to say, well, how many rakahs of Fajr are there? And obviously everybody says 2. Is that a Sunni thing or is that a Shi'i thing? And it's neither, right?
Sure.
The fast of the month of Ramadan, right? We all know, we may have, many debates, for example, about the sighting of the moon, right? But everybody agrees that there's this month called Shahr Ramadan, and that when it begins, we do the fast, and that fast is from before the sunrise until sunset, and those are things that are so ubiquitous in the Islamic tradition that there's no debate about them, right? There's
in the Sunni tradition, those are things that are called ma huwa ma'lumun min ad-dini bid-durura. So things that are known to be from the religion by necessity.
Exactly.
Right.
The same concept exists like in the Shi'i tradition about these sort of absolute fundamentals that undergird, the historical tradition and the transmission of Islam. And, so then when you get to, for example, debates about the intricacies of prayer, for example, the qanut, who does qanut and under what conditions and what do you say when you do the qanut, right? There's literally thousands of pages of debate about that specific issue. The organizers told me to mention if there's any books that I wanted to show. So, for example, on this issue, a very helpful text is this book called The Origins of the Shia, Identity, Ritual, and Sacred Space in 8th Century Kufa by Najm Haider, who's at Barnard College in New York, and we were classmates at Princeton. So he has chapters on, for example, the qunut, the dua that you make in the prayer, and the basmala, saying, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in the prayer. And if you read those chapters, and he goes through all of the Sunnis, he goes through the 4 Sunni schools and the Jafari school and the Zaydi school being the 2 predominant Shi'i legal schools. And he goes through many of the narrations that are about these issues. You see the enormous intellectual ferment and diversity, that is exemplified by these particular details, right? But what those things often obscure are the ma'lum min ad-din bid-durura, right? The things that are necessarily known to be of the religion. Someone's asking in the comments, is it easy to read? Is it non-academic? No, it's very, very dense and very academic. Najm Haider is a very serious historian, and he likes to write things for other historians that take it seriously. So my point is to say that, like, when I'm talking about the Sunni and the Shi'i tradition, I'm talking about sort of historical traditions that exist on top of that meta-Islam, right? And so what makes them distinct, right? And so some people, for example, will say, well, why do you talk about Sunni and Shi'i? Why don't you talk about just being Muslim? So my response would be, well, to talk about just being Muslim, we need to talk about the things that we all share in common, right?
Sure.
So, for example, the Aman message that was brought together in, I think, 2008 by the King Abdullah of Jordan, which included both Sunni and Shi'i scholars, affirmed that, for example, Tawheed, Akhirah, and Nubuwa, monotheism, believing in a life after death, and believing in the Quranic prophets, are the essential core beliefs of Islam that all Muslims share.
All
Right?
Muslims
Not a
share.
Sunni
Sure.
thing or a Shi'i
Sure.
thing. Same with the 5 prayers, same with the fast of the Shahr Ramadan, same with the Hajj, and so on and so forth. Right. So these are the things that are just Muslim. So what are the things that are distinctive about like the Sunni tradition versus the Shi'i tradition?
Yeah.
So I think that's very important to make clear, because we're not talking about two totally separate entities historically. We're talking about two ways of looking at that larger phenomenon that we call Islam. And so, it's appropriate to say Sunni Islam and Shi'i Islam, Sunni Muslims, Shi'i Muslims, if you want to make that distinction. So,
I think that's very
conversation.
important. I think that's very important, and I want to first, commend you for that early ecumenical spirit that, kind of guided your journey. I think many of us, as converts to Islam, we tend to see, and I'm only referencing my own experience and a few people that have also mentioned to me anecdotally, that we tend to see the Shi'i tradition as a more provincial tradition because it is not a majoritarian tradition. So we see it as being less universal. We see it as being more ethnically specific to Iranians and people in Eastern Iraq. But I've learned that this is not the case at all. And although it is correct to say that the Shi'i tradition is representative of a numerical minority, it has always been a very widespread tradition in terms of people adhering to the Shi'i tradition. Would you say that this is the case?
I would. And I think that we have to understand that, the Shi'i tradition shouldn't just be understood as the, numerically, majority 12er Shi'i tradition, the Ithna Ashari tradition, or the Jafari school. Right? It also includes the Zaydi school. It also includes the Ismailis. When I was a member of the Muslim Students Association at Brown University, all the way back in 2000 approximately, there was someone in our community is from the Bohra community, Bohra, and I had to learn, well, what does it mean to be Bohra? Well, Bohra is a sort of branch of the Ismaili tradition, which is has its own history. The phenomenon that we call in Arabic tashayyu, is widespread, and it has different flavors, and it has different lineages, and it has different formations intellectually and politically in history. And so what is one way of thinking about it? A definition that I like, which comes from a very early scholar named Aban ibn Taghlib, that he was asked for a definition of what is tashayyu. And he said that when there's two narrations or two opinions from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, take the one that agrees with the viewpoint of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, Imam Ali, the first Imam for the Shi'is. And then if there's two opinions that are narrated from Imam Ali, then take the opinion that it concurs with the viewpoint of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, the sixth Shi'i Imam, who is a teacher of Abu Hanifa and Malik and others, who is considered the sort of foundation of the Shi'i legal school from the Ja'fari perspective, and also revered by the Ismailis as well. And so different to a certain extent from the Zaydi tradition. So let me give another book that's helpful, Text and Interpretation Imam Jafar as-Sadiq and his legacy in Islamic law. This book just recently came out from Harvard University Press by my former professor at Princeton, Hussein Madarisi, who's widely acknowledged as one of the great experts of Islamic law in the Western world. He has an extensive traditional training from growing up in Iran as a scholar from a scholarly family, but then supplemented that with a PhD at Oxford, and he's been a professor at Princeton for many decades. This book, I think, definitively shows that Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, was a Shi'i in terms of our understanding, and that later narrations that sort of characterize him as a sort of adhering to Sunni theology are, later interpolations. And so, this is a very detailed and historically grounded text about Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, and so this should become in the English language a sort of fundamental canonical piece about who he was and what he taught. And the foundation of the Jafari legal school. So, this viewpoint about Tashayya in this regard is a very, you could say, historically grounded perspective that has to do with these early figures and what they taught. And in this case, the Prophet Muhammad, Imam Ali, and Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, who was, for those who don't know the dates, was active in the later Umayyad and early Abbasid period, so around the middle 700s, so a little bit earlier than Abu Hanifa and Malik, and that's why he's considered one of their teachers. And so, if we look at it in this way, right, we can see that sometimes we have a tendency to look at these traditions as fully formed very early on. Mm-hmm. That's just not historically true. It doesn't hold up. These things take time to develop.
No, and the same thing could be said of what later became known as the Sunni tradition. I mean, these are, it's not this composite that, those early generations inherited from the Prophet ﷺ or bequeathed to the generations that directly preceded them. Or that succeeded them, but rather, all, religious tradition is kind of a conversation between the dead, the living, and the unborn, right? And it takes time for traditions to, mature so that they are, so that they kind of, they are, sufficiently distinct to be identified as traditions, right? I think that's probably the case with every aspect of our Islamic history, whether we're talking legal schools, when, Malik or Shafi'i, Shafi'i might be distinguished as the first person engaging in a kind of self-conscious, interpretive, jurisprudential, like this is my minhaj kind of activity. But certainly Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, there was no notion of a Maliki way or a Hanafi way. These were continuations of what they had been learning from scholars like Ja'far as-Sadiq, radiyallahu anhu, Ibrahim al-Nakhai for Abu Hanifa, and the like. So that certainly wouldn't be anything unique to the Shi'i tradition. I don't think that's unique to any tradition, right? But you did jump ahead in a way that maybe we should go back, because you could shed some light on some of the theological distinctions of, say, the Ithna Ashar, Ithna Ashari Shi'i tradition. What are some of those theological distinctions? Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been told, just in my training, and that training might have been admittedly polemical, that most of the Shi'i theological tradition is Mu'tazili. It's dominant with of course some branches and some revision, but its dominant flavor is a rationalist, Mu'tazili flavor. Would you say that that's accurate?
Oh, this would be a good example of like to understand the historical development is shed some light on that question. So if you look at, the creed of Sheikh Saduq, who was essentially a Shi'i muhaddith, it's similar to a certain extent in character to a type of like hadith-centric theology you would find in the Sunni tradition, as exemplified most typically by, the Hanbali school. But, you find similar, tendencies amongst Maliki theologians, for example, Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, for example. And so Sheikh, generally the kind of canonical scholars, right? Like, for example, in the Ash'ari school, you'll say there's Juwayni, then there's El-Ghazali. Like, you have to know that, Juwayni came first and El-Ghazali came second. And, there's sort of a ferment there that's happening. In the Shi'i tradition, it's like a Sheikh al-Saduq and then a Sheikh al-Mufid. And so a Sheikh al-Mufid, he's considered, to have taken his teacher's theology and to begin to rationalize it. So there's a book that goes into this in detail called The Theology of Sheikh al-Mufid that was published in the late 70s. Actually, Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah wrote an academic review of it back when he was still in Western academia before he left. So Sheikh al-Mufid sort of took that more sort of hadith centric theology and started to rationalize it. In that regard, it's similar in flavor, you could say, to the way that Ash'ari was considered to have taken the Ahl Hadith or the Ahl Hadith kind of theological tradition and begun to rationalize it. And then there's Sharif al-Murtada, who comes after Sheikh al-Mufid, who is considered sort of seen as the greater flowering of a sort of neo-Mu'tazili theology within the context of what was normally when we talk about the early Ja'fari or 12er Shi'i tradition, people often call it the Imami tradition. So these scholars are sort of sort of the proto 12er Shi'i scholars, Imami scholars that were active in formulating theological statements, and their texts are still studied in the Hausa system, the seminary system of Iraq and Iran, and elsewhere today, right? But they're not in the Sunni, especially in like the Western kind of neo-traditional Sunni Sufi world, where there's kind of like emphasis on studying mutun, like texts. Like, and so you have like a class, a dars for like the public on creed of Imam Tahawi, for example. 12er Shi'is don't really do that so much, like publicly, in the sense that like people don't sit down and read the creed of a Sheikh Saduq, with a shar and a sheikh and a dars, like, publicly. That's for like the religious specialists who study those creedal statements and then maybe write new books of theology, right? There's sort of a strong emphasis on continuing to develop the tradition and continuing the tradition of rational theology. And then it trickles down to the community in the form of lectures, in the form of discussions of the 5, sort of fundamental principles of Shi'i theology that are often, articulated as divine oneness, divine justice, prophethood, imamate, and life after death. Right. And so you'll find, that will come into that stuff that is happening in the seminary system in the houses of Iraq and Iran at a much higher level is sort of trickling down into discussions of those 5 fundamental principles of 12er Shi'i theology today that, kids will learn in Sunday school. Like my son is in a Shi'i Sunday school out here in San Jose. So they'll discuss those 5 terms in the 3rd grade, and then there'll be much more extensive book length discussions that are read by people who want to be kind of like more literate in the theological tradition. But then there's the more voluminous Arabic texts that are studied in the Hausa system, and those three medieval scholars are considered kind of fundamental pillars of the development of that theology that really did latch on to some aspects of the Ghazali tradition and then put it into conversation with the 12 hadith tradition. So are you still there?
Well, so if I understand you correctly, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, your video is frozen.
Have I lost you?
I can hear you. Okay.
I still. Oh, okay. Yeah. No. I still. Oh, you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Wait. Are you hearing me? Can you hear me? Okay. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that to say that Shi'i theology is Mu'tazili is only partly true. Meaning, as that theology is disseminated among, Shi'is, it would perhaps be inaccurate to say that every Shi'i is a card-carrying Mu'tazili or something like that. But those rationalist expressions of, kind of a classical 12er Shi'i theology certainly do exist. They are studied among religious specialists. They are studied, in the houses of Iran, as you mentioned, in places like Qum, right? But to say that every Shi'i is a self-identified Mu'tazili or a self-identified rationalist might be something of an overstatement. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, definitely. To understand this, you also have to understand that later on, one of the great, divides in the Shi'i community, intellectually, you could say similar to how like Deobandis and Barelwis are the great modern divide in the Hanafi community, is the divide between what are called the Akhbaris and the Usulis. And the Akhbaris were the heirs to, that sort of very hadith-centric tradition of the 12er Shi'i community. And, there were certain scholars, for example, that really disliked any sort of rational theology from the Akhbari perspective. And this was later, right? So this was a reaction, if you will, to this earlier trajectory of thought. And then the Usulis, to a certain extent, doubled down on the rationalization, and particularly as it's found in a master scholar, right? And this had to do, I think, with both, to a certain extent. It has implications in the theological realm, in the legal realm, and also in the mystical realm. And so, that's a whole long history and not something that I'm super specialized in anyways. But it's just important to point that out, to say that, like, in the modern period, the Usuli school is definitely the dominant one. But the impact of the Akhbari movement, I think, is very real in regards to how she's, conceptualized religious authority. And so, oftentimes, for example, it's very similar to the Sunni tradition. When someone wants to challenge the intellectual authority of, like, the master scholar, the Ayatollah, the Mujtahid, the Marja, oftentimes they might do so based on a more like historicized view of the development of the tradition that is very hadith centric, and similar to how, not exactly similar, but somewhat similar to how a Salafi would then begin quoting all of these sahih hadith, in face of the the fatwa of the more usuli type scholar, like, I don't know, Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya or something like that, and questioning their ability to, render judgment upon a particular theological or legal or mystical issue from their sort of embodiment of the tradition, and sort of bringing in back, the sort of focus on textual authority. So that dynamic is there in the 12er Shi'i tradition is too.
No,
So
no. Mashallah. I realized that, in this conversation, be getting out in front of some of our attendees, some of our viewers. So I want to kind of reel it in a little bit. I want to come back to concepts that are perhaps a little more basic, and I want to talk about some Sunni prejudices about Shi'ism, the Shi'i tradition, and maybe have you kind of talk through some of those, helping to, I guess, broaden our understanding of those issues, because what I would like to happen, what I would like to come from this conversation, is for most of our viewers, the vast majority of whom I think would identify as Sunni, to have a much better, albeit introductory, understanding of the Shi'i tradition. And maybe out of that, there can be more curiosity, more interest, more dialogue, more fellowship, community. So for people who think this Sunni-Shi'i issue is really just a question of succession to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? That, Shiism is a religious orientation born out of the political question of succession. And to be a Shi'i is essentially to just believe Ali should have been the Khalifa after the demise of the Prophet ﷺ. And there are some people, that's all they know about Shiism. Perhaps you can shed some light on it. Perhaps you can give us some tawsiya, to broaden our understanding of how the issue of succession is understood among Shi'is.
Sure. Because
is there a delay? Oh,
I'm hearing your audio okay, but the video is choppy, so I don't know if there's a delay in the audio too.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
No, you're good. You're good on my end. No, you're good on my end. I don't. Maybe it's. But please address that query.
Okay. So because you mentioned that the majority of people probably watching this discussion are from the Sunni community, I think it's helpful to give a kind of metaphor, if you will, that might help make it more sense. And I think that has to do with, the way that we relate to our religious authorities. In, for example, the Sufi tradition, people often find that, people have an intense degree of attachment to their sheikh, right? That they ask their sheikh what job they should do. Should they do this job? Who they should marry? Where they should live? What dhikr they should make? All these different things, right? They manifest a great deal of attachment to their teacher. And that may just be teachers in general. Like some people just have one teacher that they love so much that they would die for them, really, when it came down to religious matters. And I think that, to sort of kind of step back a little bit from the early history, but to understand, perhaps what Shiism, is at its core, it's a deep love and reverence and awe of Imam Ali and of Sayyidah Fatima, his wife, the daughter of the Prophet, and of their children, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, so much so that it's almost impossible to imagine that they would lead us astray in the religion, right? That just as someone, today might have a sheikh that they just so trust and they so believe is, as they've been studying for 20 years, the traditional sciences, and they've never seen them do anything wrong. I mean, I see these kind of expressions of love for shuyukh so often, like especially when they die, that this person was the reviver of the sunnah and the mujaddid of the age and all these things, sheikh shuyukh, there's a very similar, just setting all the sort of theology and history behind it, to the side, and just sort of saying that for many Shi'is, the relationship with what are called the Ahl Kisa, the people of the cloak, and this is something that is acknowledged by both the Sunni and the Shi'i Hadith tradition, is so deep that it's like an ocean that you can never fully draw from. And so why would you look anywhere else, right? And so, and the point is to say that those people are all reflections of the prophetic reality, right? That they are the means to access the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there's the famous hadith about, ana madinatul ilm wa ali babuha, right? Again, both in the Sunni and Shi'i tradition acknowledge that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, said, I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate, right? And so for the Shi'is, like, done deal. Like that's it. Like, what else do I need? And when you hear some of the greatest Shi'i ulama talking about Imam Ali, they're like, wama adraka ma Ali. And they'll say that they use this Quranic rhetorical language and say, like, what could you possibly know about Ali, right? Let alone the Prophet himself. Right? So there's this idea that, like, if you really understand Ali, you'll realize like how little you know of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I think what that does is it engenders, so that tashayya, right? Like that concept that is that broad concept in early Islamic history, it is centered on, the person of Imam Ali and Sayyidah Fatima and Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, in the sense of just that the sort of original meaning of Shia as it's found in the Quran when it says, that Ibrahim was a Shia of Prophet Noah, right? That he was like an intense and faithful and loyal follower, an exemplar of what that meant. And so to be a Shia of Imam Ali, that's the original name is, Shia to Ali, right? The partisan or the follower of the ally or the loyal supporter of Imam Ali. And so when a Shi'i looks at early Islamic history, for example, they want to know, what is Imam Ali doing during the caliphate of Abu Bakr and Omar and Uthman, right? They're intensely interested in that question. Like what exactly is going on with him at that time? Because if I were there, I would just want to be hanging around Imam Ali, right? Like if the Khalifa, whoever it was, is saying, hey, we're going to go here and we're going to do this battle and this ghazwa, whatever, the Shia mentality is like, well, let me go talk to Ali first and see what he thinks, right? Like, it's sort of the focal point is not the Khalifa. The focal point is Imam Ali from the moment the Prophet passes. So from the Shi'i perspective, I'll just give you like an example, right? 15 years in the Sunni community, I can't know how many times the vignette was told that when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam died, that Omar became very agitated and made some sort of threatening remarks, outside of the masjid of the Prophet, and Abu Bakr had to calm him down and recites the verse of the Quran that reminds people, not to turn back on their heels, that this is that we worship Allah who never dies, right? And so we keep on the mission, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So like that was like a paradigmatic vignette, historical vignette that was just like drilled into my head over and over and over again. In the Shia community, it's like that doesn't even really, you don't even mention it. You're just like kind of intensely focused on what is Ali doing at that moment. And at that moment, he's with the body of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's the one who stays with the body of the Prophet, and then does the burial himself. He does the ghusl and the burial, right? So for the Shi'i lens, if you will, on early Islamic history, it's like, well, we're not even concerned about what's going on with the rest of the community. We're totally focused on Imam Ali and Sayyidah Fatima and their grief and their, sort of shepherding of the body of the Prophet into the earth and doing the janazah and so on and so forth. Right. So it's like we're all familiar with the idea of a court case, right? Mm-hmm. And there's different perspectives on what happened, and you have different witnesses and different angles, and you try to reconstruct the history. In many respects, like the Shi'i focus on those early events is just what is Ali doing? What is Fatima doing? What is Hassan doing? What is Hussein doing? Mm-hmm. And that creates a very different like historical picture than when the focus is on what is the Khalifa and the armies doing, right? Mm-hmm. Because Imam Ali was not part of those armies, even though he was one of the major, if not the major military leader under the leadership of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He does not serve as a general in the armies, of the other three Khalifas, right? Mm-hmm. Then in terms of that narrative, the sort of narrative generally shifts to Khalid ibn al-Walid for Sunnis, and so the Shi'i mentality is sort of focused in on like, well, what does that mean? What does it mean that Ali, who was the bravest champion at Khaybar and Hunayn and Uhud and so on and so forth, like why isn't he participating in that way anymore? These raise types of questions that just aren't like, if you just go to Friday khutbah after Friday khutbah after Friday khutbah and dars after dars after dars in a sort of mainstream Sunni historical perspective, it just doesn't really get addressed. It's not really,
So the historical narrative that is certainly found in a lot of the work of Sunni historians, Ibn Sa'ad, Waqidi, Tabari, that Sayyidina Ali, after burying the Prophet ﷺ, came to Sayyidina Abu Bakr after he had been essentially elected the Khalifa and said, we were presented, he's referring to himself, with something as a done, concluded matter that we might have a say-so in, right? Meaning leadership of the community. But he, gave his bay'ah, he gave his pledge of allegiance to Sayyidina Abu Bakr, right? While voicing some objection to his not being able to stake his claim, as it were, to leadership within the community. Is that something accepted by mainstream Shi'i scholars as well, that he did voice objection to the way the process was carried out, but then he did offer his pledge of allegiance to Sayyidina Abu Bakr?
I think that if you ask, the majority Shi'i community in the world today, many people would, reject the idea that Ali freely gave his bay'ah to Abu Bakr. And then I would say that what you would find is, sort of varying strategies to try and, if there are historical accounts that say that, to try and, discount them. For example, to say that the bay'ah was forced. As I mentioned, I don't think about these things the way that a lot of people do. My PhD training at Princeton, my first round of PhD training was, really hypercritical, sort of critical historical methodology of early Islam. And I have a lot of, personal skepticism towards a lot of the historical claims of both the Sunni and the Shi'i tradition. When I come against like a subject like this, my first thought is that every source that we have was written after all of this had happened,
Sure.
after Karbala, after the persecution of the Ahlul Bayt, after decades and decades and sometimes even centuries of the formation of the early community. And I don't think that you can always just like take, you mentioned Waqidi or Ibn Sa'd, you can just take them at face value, right? That they were also people that were ensconced in particular sectarian milieus and were trying to make an argument about, what they thought was the most legitimate. They weren't just sort of objectively and neutrally compiling, narrations. I mean, not to say that they were involved in some sort of like propaganda either, but just to say that like we, as people living in the 21st century, when we go back and we look at those texts, we have to be honest with ourselves and be critical about them. And this goes for both, Sunni and Shi'i texts. It's not to say that one has it and the other one doesn't. So just, so for example, on this particular point, like, if you read like a standard book of Shi'i, kind of apologetics, is the term that is used to sort of defend your own tradition. Right, this will be a discussion. There'll be, did Imam Ali give his bay'ah to Abu Bakr? Let's look at the sources. For me, when I was thinking through this particular issue, I found that sometimes like the kind of more standard arguments that were given weren't particularly compelling to me, on either side. Right, they seem like to be like set pieces in a sort of polemical battle. So, I would just, and this is something that also requires a little bit of explaining. I mean, as a convert, and I don't know how your experience was, but as a convert, like the reality is that why am I Muslim? I'm a Muslim because, I sort of ostensibly went to a bookstore one day, bought this book called the Quran, which I didn't even know what it was saying in Arabic, but I had to read it in English translation. And I'm sitting here going, oh, maybe God is real. Right?
Sure.
If an English translation of the Quran in 7th century Arabic text can convince a sort of skeptical, secular humanist who I was back then that like God is talking to me, right? It kind of changes the nature of epistemology. It kind of changes the nature of how we know what we know. And I have to, admit that my faith is built upon that subjective experience of reading the text. Right? That it, not to say that it's purely subjective, right? But it's to say that there's many people out there that go and read the same book. They go to Barnes and Noble and they buy the Quran and they're like, not for me. Right? Like that's the world we live in. That's the way Allah has created the dunya.
That will always be the world. Sure.
What?
I said that will probably always be the world.
Yeah. And so, what is it that gives us faith? Well, I've had my experiences and I've shared with so many people over the years that they've had their experiences. Like, what is the basis of your faith? And so, for example, someone might say, well, I opened up this verse of the Quran and it said, we will show them our signs in the heavens and the horizons and in themselves until they come to realize that it's the truth. And then I looked at the book and I looked up at the mountain that was before me and the trees. And I said, maybe God's real and maybe God's talking to me in the Quran, right? So keeping that in mind, I did a khatam of the Quran, with the intention of like, God, tell me, like, is this like leading me towards the Sunni tradition or the Shi'i tradition? And, this is back when I was still contemplating these things, like, in terms of trying to make a decision. And, I'd say that, and I agree with Jonathan Brown's assessment that one of the proofs of the Quran's historical authenticity from the time of the Prophet is that it doesn't often go one way or the other, right? If the Quran had, like the Hadith literature obviously is filled with sectarian stuff. I mean, that's anyone with any sort of historical consciousness, if you look through the Hadith literature broadly, can see that there's just an enormous and immense sectarian battle happening through Hadith. Right? But the Quran doesn't show the traces of that. And so as Jonathan Brown says, I think he makes this point somewhere in the middle of the book, misquoting Muhammad, if I remember correctly, right? That that the Quran, came clearly before all of that went down, and it was utilized by both communities to try and justify their claims, right? So I'm reading the Quran, and I'm trying to make sense out of this as 21st century American person, a intellectual task that many people would probably find absurd, but I was trying to be very serious that I believe that God is watching me, and God is going to ask me on Yawm al-Qiyamah, on the day of judgment, like, why did you do what you do? And I'm trying to absolve myself before God of, like, what am I supposed to do? I don't know. I mean, I'm just one guy. How can I judge the veracity of these two immense, intellectual traditions that I'm just a student of? But I'm trying to make an educated guess. So I'm reading the Quran, and there's, a particular verse where there's a dialogue between the Prophet Musa and the Prophet Harun. Right? Now, for the Shi'i tradition, the fact that the Quran focuses more on Musa and Harun than anybody else is very important, right? Because this hadith that is in both the Sunni and the Shi'i tradition, that the relationship between the Prophet and Imam Ali is like the relationship between Harun and Musa, with the distinction that Ali will never have the rank of Nubuwwah, right? But otherwise, there's a similarity there. And so the Quran itself is emphasizing this relationship, that this was this great moment when two people who were, brothers, right, and their kinsmen went up against, the Taghut, went up against the falsehood. And that's very important that it emphasizes the two of them in the Quran. And so in this vignette where the Musa goes away, on the sort of to talk with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the moment in that sort of sacred history when the golden calf started to be worshipped. When Musa comes back, he's very angry with Harun, and he asks him, like, why? How did you let this happen? And Harun's response is, I was afraid that you would be upset that I divided the community.
فرقت بين بني إسرائيل.
Yep.
Yeah. And this is the sort of Taha.
Yeah. So when I'm reading that, I'm thinking, okay, well, it's universally acknowledged that Imam Ali is one of the greatest experts, if not the greatest expert of the Quran after the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's universally acknowledged that he was one of the closest people to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this hadith is generally considered to be, delivered when the Prophet left Imam Ali in charge of Medina when he had to go away from Medina. And so he's saying, don't worry about, our relationship, because you are to me like Harun was to me. So I'm going to go, and you have the same level kind of authority in my absence as Harun did when Musa left to go speak with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in that moment, if Imam Ali, who's a member, Hafidh of Quran and understands its meanings and stuff, he obviously is remembering this particular vignette, that the excuse that was given by the Prophet Harun was that he wanted to keep the community together, right? And that was so important that he even thought it was okay to let them worship a golden calf, right? Not okay, but like my point is that
he didn't intervene to stop.
Right, he didn't intervene. So if that's what the Quran is saying, then surely if Imam Ali has objections to the political and military leadership of the community, but he has no support, to offer an alternative, right? And there's these many narrations, for example, where even Sayyidah Fatima is going around trying to be like, people, like, how come you have left Imam Ali? Or how come you have left us? How come you haven't, helped us establish our claim, right? That Imam Ali was someone who wanted the unity of the community, and whatever his actions he took, and this is, the debate, again, the historians can sift through all the narrations and have their debates, that the Shia understanding is that the unity of the community was central to his heart, right? But then that is made even more powerful by the fact that when he is given the Khilafah, right, 3 successive waves of Muslims attack him and try and remove him from power. Right? That he is not, the claim is often put on, like, the Shi'is, like, well, why do you want him to attack the leaders? Like, no, we're the followers of Imam Ali who didn't attack the leaders. When Imam Ali became the Khalifa, he was the one who was attacked, right? And at the battles of Jamal and the battle of Siffin and the battle of Nahrawan, right? So historically speaking, for the Shia, right, that to follow Imam Ali is to be deeply invested in the unity of the community, even if you may feel that the political or military leadership is not living up to the ideals of Islam in some sort of way, right? And then this becomes, exemplified again for the 4th Shi'i Imam, Imam Zain al-Abidin, after the Battle of Karbala, right, who has to maintain continuing the way of the Ahlul Bayt and the way of his family, even though, I think the total count was 17 of his family members were killed at the Battle of Karbala, including Imam Hussein, including 2 of his brothers, including his uncle Abbas, and so many other members of both the Hassani and the Husseini branches of the Sayyids. And he has to live under Umayyad authority, even who these people, the sort of military faction, you can say, that killed his own family, and he has no real recourse to, upending that. And so, this is part of, like, the Shi'i sacred history that then undergirds how Shi'is imagine these times from, the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in 632 up until, the early 700s.
No, it's interesting because,
okay,
definitely. I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you with me?
I can hear you.
But definitely,
I think there's some delay.
In kind of in kind of a post formative period of early Sunni theology, this doctrine of istiqamat al-Sahaba, believing in the uprightness of the Sahaba, which, most Sunni scholars don't even hide the fact that this was a doctrine that was created to suggest that any idea that there was a willful attempt to bar Sayyidina Ali from something that was rightfully his. Now, everybody maintains that people could have been wrong on the basis of ta'wil. They had an understanding that was maybe a ghultan. It was incorrect. But that there were willful attempts on behalf of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ to block, bar, exclude Sayyidina Ali from something that was rightfully given to him by the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, this becomes a major bone of contention between Sunnis and Shi'is, right? And I read a book. Man, this oddly enough, when I first became Muslim, I used to travel around the United States as the assistant to a book vendor. Right? There was a brother who sold books at outdoor festivals, and he was Trinidadian. He was from Trinidad, but he was a Shi'i Muslim, and I think he had initially become Muslim in Trinidad, and then he had embraced the Shi'i path as his own in New York City. He gave me a book called "Then I Was Guided" by a Tunisian Sunni scholar who became Shi'i. And one of his arguments was Sunnis maintain this doctrine of istiqamat al-Sahaba, that all of the Sahaba were, upright. And for us to question their intent is impious. But he said, all of them acknowledge before the wafat of the Prophet ﷺ, the community was made up of the Muhajirun, the Ansar, and the Munafiqun, people that, were technically companions of the Prophet ﷺ, but did not have Iman. So how can they, use this blanket doctrine of istiqamat al-Sahaba, right? That the Sahaba are all upright. And of course, Sunni scholars countered that the names of the munafiqeen were known. The people that were munafiqeen were known. So, it's exploring that early history and seeing how you had doctrinal developments and of course historical developments that are clearly sectarian in their thrust. I think is a good exercise for our community, personally. Are you still with me?
Yeah. Sorry, was there a specific question, or you just wanted me to respond?
I was just making a comment there. But I wanted to ask you now, because we only have about 20 minutes. You mentioned the intellectual, you mentioned the legal, but you also mentioned the mystical when you were kind of, enumerating the different dimensions of kind of tashayyu'a, different expressions of tashayyu'a. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of those mystical dimensions. Would it be safe to say that these are parallels to kind of Sufism in the Sunni tradition?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of overlap between the emergence of the Shi'i schools of thought, and this is in response to Shireen's question in the chat about using the word school of thought. In the Shi'i schools of thought, there's a lot of overlap with the emergence of tasawwuf, of the Sufi tradition. Mm-hmm. Technically speaking, historians say that the Sufi tradition really began in Baghdad in the time of approximately the time of El Junaid, and this corresponds with the era of the greater or the minor occultation of the 12th Imam of the 12 Rashid tradition, and so both events, both sort of historical memories are heavily tied in with the you could say the devolving of the more caliphal model of authority, right? This is a great discussion in the first 3 centuries of Islam, is like, when was the caliphate strong and when was it devolving, and so on and so forth. But clearly, for example, the civil war between Amin and Ma'mun that happened, these were the 2 sons of Harun al-Rashid in the Abbasid Caliphate, was a very devastating thing for those who had invested a lot in caliphal authority as a sort of important element of the Islamic tradition. And I think one could argue that there's an inward turn that happens after this, that there's a focal point on a more mystical approach to the tradition that looks for authority not in the grand public authorities, but in individual scholars and exemplars of spiritual states and of knowledge, and that emphasis continues to this day, right? So that people go looking for teachers, whether they consider them el-insan al-kamil, like perfect people, or not, is not the point, but they go looking for these kind of exemplars, and usually those people are seen as sort of somewhat hidden from mainstream society, and they have to be sought out. So I think that in many respects, there's a parallel between sort of Shi'i modes of mystical piety and Sunni Sufi modes of mystical piety, that are exemplified, for example, by retreating from the world to a certain degree and retreating from public authority, immersing oneself in what we call mustahabat, extra practices that will draw you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and increase your mystical states. And there's a lot of ferment that goes between them. So for example, just give one example, we all know, not we all know, but many people know the famous book Ihya Ulumuddin by Al-Ghazali that was sort of coming out of those Sunni strands of thought. Later on, about 4 to 5 centuries later, a scholar who was deeply immersed in the Shi'i Hadith literature named Faid Kashani, he took the Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin and rewrote it, using Shi'i Hadith literature and called it, Mahajjatul Bayda. I think it's published in 8 volumes, if I remember correctly. And there's a wonderful English translation called of the Mukhtasar, of the simplified and shortened version of that text, called Al-Mahasan li Maqarim al-Akhlaq. Is translated into English as spiritual mysteries and ethical secrets. And so when you look at that text, what you see is a sort of a similar set of concerns between Faid Kashani and Al-Ghazali about spiritual advancement, about character, about theology, about proper practice and piety, and understanding the deeper meanings of ritual worship and so on and so forth. But Faid Kashani, who was deeply immersed in the 12er Shi'i Hadith literature and even compiled massive compilations of some of them. I think, if I remember correctly, he has one text called Al-Wafi, which has something like 40,000 narrations in it. He felt that Ghazali's text needed to be sort of edited and updated because Ghazali was unaware of the 12er Hadith literature. But the point is that they were kind of sharing a similar set of concerns, and he was so impressed or moved or inspired by Ghazali's approach to the issues that he kept the fundamental structure of the Ihya, and then as I said, just sort of added his own take on it. And so when we get to the modern period, for example, like you have an enormous concern for kind of mystical ascent and pious reform of the self amongst 12er Shi'is. I think the difference is that and there's a long history to this, is that the sort of, there's not a lot of like 12er Shi'i Sufi orders that are like for the masses, right? The way that like Naqshbandis are like have who knows how many Naqshbandis, millions upon millions, all over the world, Naqshbandis or Qadiris or things like that. In the 12er Shi'i tradition, in the contemporary world, there's much more of an emphasis on those lineages being for the ulama, and that they're kind of supposed to be hidden amongst the ulama, such that they don't distract from the larger unity of the 12er ulama. I mean, I think that's how it's supposed to be in theory. Of course, you end up having like very public disputes, as there are in all religious traditions, about this, that, or the other thing. But so it's very common, for example, once you get to know like a 12er Shi'i alim, that he might actually have he might be part of like a specific irfani, which is the term that's usually used in the 12er tradition to represent the mystical tradition. They may be part of a certain irfani lineage, but they don't make that public, right? That's for them, and for their group of students who follow their sheikh, who may be in Qom or Najaf or wherever. And then again, it trickles down to the Shi'i masses in terms of the more public events. For example, that I'll give you a perfect example. I went to the Majalis for Imam Hussein last year at this center where my son goes to Sunday school down in San Jose, called Seba. And the scholar who spoke, who was, they have concurrent, they have Farsi, English, Arabic, and Urdu, all in separate rooms. So wherever you feel most comfortable, like going through those stories and those discussions, you go to that room. So I went to the English room, and I never heard of the scholar before, but the whole talk was like as if I had gone to a Sufi dars. Like in my experience, I would compare going to that talk to sitting in front of Sheikh Nuhamim Keller in Amman, Jordan, when I was there in the summer of 2006 studying Arabic at Qasid. I was going to a gathering of Muslims to have like insight into the mystical world, into spirituality, into ethical reformation. I got a great deal out of sitting in those gatherings. And now here I'm a Shi'i in California in 2022, and I'm going, it's a evening program, and I go and I sit in front of the sheikh, and he talks, and I was ecstatic. And he was talking about love and the ontology of love and about how Allah loves us. And, but he was clearly drawing upon all sorts of studies he's done of mystical theology, whether it's Ibn Arabi, because Ibn Arabi is very popular amongst, 12er Shi'is in terms of mystical theology, whether he's talking about, he was drawing on Mullah Sadra, whether he's drawing on Faid Kashani, Alama Tabatabai, all these kind of sort of heavyweights in the world of Shi'i mysticism. I don't know, but he was just giving it to the masses, to us, and I was like, that's what I need. That's that's really helpful for me, because
there's a culture certainly of mystical ascent and public spirituality, but it's not as initiatic, is what I mean. It's not based on this event of initiation, like with tariqas, and I took bay'ah with the sheikh, and it's certainly not nearly as public, is kind of what I glean from what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I'm sure there's all sorts of historical things that can be said about how that came to be, right? It's not like that doesn't necessarily represent how Shi'ism always has been, right? As many probably know, the Safavids, were originally a Sufi order before they became the sort of dominant political authority over, Iran. And so, there's a whole history to, how I think Sufism and Irfan and, so Mullah Sadra, who was a very, popular sort of exponent of mystical theology for 12er Shi'is, right? He had his own difficulties in terms of like persecution from others for his thoughts and his ideas. And, there's a whole reason, for example, why today, usually 12er Shi'is don't talk about tasawwuf, but talk about irfan, right? Why do they use that term? But so it all goes back to this idea about historical development. But I think, because we're running out of time, I just want to make like a really kind of central point, which is that, there's a way in which those of us who have I'd say a more academic inclination towards Islamic tradition can sometimes tend to despair of spirituality and of authenticity and of connection when you recognize the way that everything has developed historically.
Sure.
And I think what I would like to, sort of end on is this idea that the way I see both the Sunni and the 12er Shi'i tradition, I'm not an expert in the Zaydi tradition at all, nor the Ismaili tradition. So I'm not even an expert in the 12er Shi'i tradition. So I'm just someone who's trying to do their best. That I see these as living traditions, right, that meet the spiritual needs of people in the present in ways that are obviously palpable.
Sure.
Right? So going back to my vignette about talking about the Quran, right, there's no like mystical theology that I've ever read, about the Quran in that sort of way. It's just understood that, hey, Muslims, we believe that the Quran is from God, and it's a handhold, sort of a rope, the metaphor of the rope that is let down, and we grab one end of it, and sort of the other end is with Allah,
Mm.
and we feel it. We feel it in our hearts, that it is actually relevant, it's actually living, it's actually real, and it's not just a bunch of Arabic letters on a page that you buy at Barnes and Noble or you check out of the library of your university, right? I think so too for the 12er Shi'is in particular. The Imams are like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are like oceans of meaning. They are real. They are alive, right? This verse of the Quran, that you should not say about those who are killed in the way of Allah that they're dead. Know that they are living, right? That verse is often used in regards to the remembrance of Karbala and what happened to Imam Hussein,
Mm-hmm.
and so those things are really, really important for Sunnis to understand, because then the 12 Imams aren't just like these historical figures that then like passed on the tradition. They're also like, there's a way of looking at it where it's almost like it's a Sufi order with these 12 figures, with the unique caveat that the 12th Imam, right, Imam Mahdi, is the Imam for the whole world, right? He's the Sheikh for the whole world. He's the one who brings the Muhammadan reality to its full flowering in human history. And so in that regard, it is something where we have this hadith of thaqalain, of the two weighty things, and they are the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt, according to the various narrations that talk about a thaqalain, and that they will never separate from each other until they reach the Prophet at the Hawd, at the pool on the last day.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So for the Shi'is, the experience of the Imams is similar to a certain extent, their experience of knowing Allah through the Quran, right?
Mm-hmm.
That for some people the Quran is just words on a page, and for other people it's the word of God that makes them feel like God is real. In a similar way, the 14 Ma'sumin, beginning with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, including Sayyidah Fatima, and then the 12 Imams that end with Imam Mahdi, that they are also like that they are like, when you study their lives, when you reflect upon them, when you make salawat, that you feel that they are so real, and that that their guidance is not just like in their words that are transmitted in history, but there's some sort of a connection that is very real for Shi'is, that they long to see them, they love them, they have experiences where they would rather die than continue living in the world without being able to see them. And so that has to be understood, I think, for people to understand, I think, why the 12er Shi'i tradition is still so relevant for many people.
We have a couple questions from audience members that are coming in. We only have a few minutes here, but if you want to take a stab at any one of those that looks like you could answer it in a timely fashion, by all means, Dave. I'll leave you the last word.
Okay, so I don't think Nasser's question about the Arab Spring, can be answered in any sort of succinct way. I think that's an immensely complex and fraught discussion that I don't even want to jump into right now. But it's an important question, but I just don't think we can address it. I think I addressed Shireen's question about school of thought by using that term. I think madhab is a better term for a school of thought, and many people have tried to say that the Jafari school is a madhab similar to the Sunni madhabs. Some Shi'is are not comfortable with that characterization. It's a discussion, it's a debate. I don't want to give a sort of firm perspective, but I think that school of thought is definitely apt. Nora's question about being a Sunni who attends Muharram Majalis. She's saying, what else happened on Ashura and Sunni mosque isn't discussed more. So I think she's saying that, why isn't this, talked about more? I mean, the fact of the matter is, in the past, it used to be. You know, in a previous conversation I had with people, they reminded me that the Ottomans had a tradition of honoring the first 10 nights of Muharram as well. You know, so my response to them was that, well, that's awesome, but let's revive that tradition amongst Sunnis. You know, if people, you know, think that that's a good practice, like, you know, I'd be happy to contribute financially to a Sunni gathering for the first 10 nights of Muharram where they honor Imam Hussein and remember Imam Hussein and tell the story. You know, I mean, I think that for me, it was just the only option really was to go into the Shi'i community to really have that experience. But obviously, there's been overlap. People have told me that in Pakistan, for example, there's a lot more sort of cross-pollination in terms of the first 10 nights of Muharram. Ijaz mentioned that, you know, we didn't answer some of the more basic questions. I think that's my fault. I tend to be, you know, sort of more academic in my approach to things, and that's just I apologize for that. There are many other speakers that can do a good job at talking about some of the more basic things. And yes, this one person is named Emptying the Cup talks about how Jafar as-Sadiq, you know, figures prominently in many Sunni lineages of silsilas of mystical brotherhoods. So does the seventh Imam, Imam Musa al-Kadhim, and other Imams as well. So that's, you know, in terms of those historical figures, there's a great shared love for them between many Sunnis and Shi'is. And now I will just say that in regards to a couple more questions that came up, to recognize the fact that we are living in a time that is heavily, you know, sectarianized due to the rivalry between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So for the past 40 years, there's been an intense, you know, sort of ideological struggle that has played itself out in so many complex ways that we can't get into right now. But, you know, there, in many respects, like, we have to understand that we're also, you know, living in a time when many people want to see these two communities as so separate. You know, the way I respond to it is a very, you know, sort of localized way. And I say that I'm an American, and like Ubaydullah and I have been having conversations for years. You know, like, we once went to go visit our Deobandi madrasa where we both studied, you know, memorization of the Quran, to visit, you know, someone who was graduating from the ALIM program, who's now the Muslim chaplain at Brown University, you know, and who happened to grow up 2 blocks away from where I grew up. Like, that's my world. Like, I'm not going to, there's no sectarian struggle between Ubaydullah and me. I wish Ubaydullah all the success in the world and with whatever he does, right? We're you know, we are Americans who accepted Islam and who are trying our best to live the best of the Islamic tradition that we find, right? To follow that verse of the Quran that we follow the best of what we've heard. And that, you know, and I am, you know, I'm a fallible individual. I'm a flawed individual. I'm not holding myself up as, you know, sort of the authority on this issue at all, but just simply sharing my experience, you know, as a convert to Islam, winding his way through the various intellectual traditions of Islam and through the communities that have been created before me, right? That like, just as ALIM as an institution was created by people before me that I benefited from, so too has the Shi'i community created masjids and educational programs and so on and so forth that are, you know, have benefited me.
No, beautiful, beautiful. That perhaps وَخِتَامُهُ مِسْكٌ. وَخِتَامُهُ مِسْكٌ. I think that's a good place to end. I look forward to continuing to converse, man. You know, years ago, and I'll share this with the audience because I don't think, you know, you'd mind, although I probably should have checked with you. You know, Dave did challenge us at ALIM to be more open to this dialogue, more open to this conversation. And we've taken about 10 years to respond to his challenge, but we want to make good on our promise of trying to embrace a broad-based literacy for Muslim communities in the United States. And we won't be able to do that unless we have intelligent dialogue and also instruction from scholars from the Shi'i tradition, and also scholars who can speak competently about the Shi'i tradition. So I thank you for being in conversation with me this evening. And I look forward to, whatever comes next, inshallah. Thank you, Dave.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure was mine. I learned a lot. Salam alaikum.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you to Ustadh Ubaydullah and Professor David Coolidge for this engaging discussion this evening. We hope you all benefited greatly and learned a lot. I would like to remind you again that next week our book club will be at the same time. You can go to alimprogram.org/book-club to join the book club for next week, where we'll be reading the Song Poet. Ustadh Ubaydullah will join in the discussions, and you can join other students of ALIM and other community members in that engaging discussion. We'd also like to remind you that the ALIM summer program registration is open. Go to alimprogram.org and register for the summer program, where inshallah you can benefit from these kinds of discussions about our Islamic tradition and learn a lot about how we can engage as Muslims in America today. And we ask for your continued support at ALIM to support students who are attending the summer program and to support our monthly programming like Frames and the book club. Alhamdulillah, your support allows us to put these programs on. We ask you to continue to support us and inshallah always keep us in your du'as. Hope you all have a good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us.